3 meters. Just 3 meters separated the Australian commando from the sleeping Viet Cong soldier, and the Australian calmly closed his eyes and went to sleep. Right there, in the very heart of the enemy camp, surrounded by 80 enemy fighters. Madness? Suicide? No, it was a tactic. An official, rehearsed, lethal tactic of the Australian SAS that the Pentagon kept quiet about for 40 years. And today, you will find out why. Why did a handful of Australians, from a country with a population smaller than New York City, deliver results 10 times better than the best American units? Why did General Westmoreland say a phrase he later tried to retract? And why did American Rangers, attempting to copy this tactic, lose 9 men in a single night? I'm going to tell you about the method the Viet Cong called the jungle demons. About men who learned to smile in the enemy's face, literally, and vanish into the darkness. About secrets that are 50,000 years old, and about the price these _1_ paid after returning home. You will learn what the Australians left in the pockets of enemy commanders, why the smell of chewing gum could cost you your life, and how _2 became the formula for victory. Watch until the end, because the last 10 minutes will overturn everything you thought you knew about war, fear, and human capability. Let's go. They sleep with the enemy. The terrifying SAS tactic of napping inside Viet Cong camps. The Australian commando lies motionless 3 meters from a Viet Cong sentry, his breathing so quiet that even the mosquitoes can't detect it. This isn't fiction, and it isn't a scene from a Hollywood action movie. This is a real tactic that Australian SAS troopers applied in Vietnam throughout the entire war. While American Marines were burning villages and calling in airstrikes, the Australians were doing something completely unthinkable. They were infiltrating the very heart of enemy camps and falling asleep there, surrounded by hundreds of enemy soldiers. Sounds like insanity? Perhaps. But it was precisely this insanity that gave the Australian SAS the highest kill ratio of any Allied force in Vietnam. The Pentagon hid this information for decades because it called the entire American military doctrine into question. How could a handful of Australians, a country with a population smaller than a single borough of New York, outperform the greatest military machine in human history? The answer lies in a tactic that shocked even the seasoned American Green Berets and MACV-SOG operators. But what the Australians were doing in the jungle was just the tip of the iceberg. The Australians didn't fight the jungle, they became part of it. They didn't hunt the enemy, they lived among them. And the most terrifying part, they slept in his bed. 1962 was the turning point for the Australian Armed Forces. That was when the first military advisors from Canberra arrived in Vietnam, and that was when the story began that would overturn all concepts of how jungle warfare should be fought. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment, the SAS, received a task that seemed impossible: to control vast territories of Phuoc Tuy province with minimal casualties and without the massive fire support the Americans relied on. Command in Canberra understood. A small country has no resources for a war of attrition. Every dead Australian was a national tragedy that could not be hidden from the public. And then the SAS found a solution that made the hair stand up on the necks of American generals. Instead of building huge bases with barbed wire perimeters and searchlights, the Australians went into the jungle in small teams of 4 to 6 men and vanished for up to 21 days. They didn't carry radio beacons for air support. They didn't set up ambushes with machine gun fire. They simply dissolved into the green hell and began the hunt. Silent, methodical, ruthless. American liaison officers attached to Australian units initially thought this was some twisted joke from the Southern Hemisphere. Captain James Warfield of the U.S. 5th Special Forces Group arrived at the Australian base in Nui Dat in 1967 with the firm conviction that his mission was to teach these country cousins real warfare. 3 months later, he wrote a report that Command in Saigon classified for the next 40 years. In this document, Warfield admitted the Australians possess techniques that U.S. Special Forces cannot even conceptualize. He was particularly stunned by the practice the Australians casually called sleeping over, penetrating the perimeter of an enemy camp and sleeping in immediate proximity to the enemy. Why is sleeping next to the enemy safer than sleeping far away from him? The answer lies in understanding the psychology of war. The Viet Cong were masters of night attacks. Their tactic was built on a simple principle: locate the enemy position, surround it in the darkness, attack at dawn. But the Australians found a fatal flaw in this system. American patrols setting up overnight positions in the jungle were easy prey. Cigarette glows, the smell of American soap and deodorant, the noise of radios all betrayed their positions for kilometers. Vietnamese scouts located the Americans long before darkness fell and called in main forces for the attack. The statistics were unrelenting. American patrol groups suffered casualties in night skirmishes 7 times more often than the Australians. The Australians flipped this logic on its head. If the enemy is looking for you outside his camp, then the safest place is inside. This idea didn't come from textbooks at the Duntroon Military Academy, but from the experience of Aboriginal trackers whom the Australian Army had engaged as instructors since the 1950s. What these trackers taught had no analog in any army in the world. Aboriginals had practiced a hunting style for millennia, where the hunter literally enters the herd of prey and selects the victim from within. Transferring this concept to human warfare required iron nerves and skills that an ordinary soldier could not master in a standard training course. SAS operator training for Vietnam operations took 18 months, 3 times longer than American Green Berets. A significant portion of this time was spent learning silent movement. Not just quiet, absolutely silent. The selection methods were so brutal that only a few survived. Australian instructors forced candidates to walk across a bed of dry twigs in total darkness. One snap, and the candidate was cut. No second chances, no retests. Out of every 100 volunteers, 12 to 15 men passed the course. The rest returned to regular infantry units with a recommendation never to mention what they had tried to learn. Those who passed selection gained skills bordering on mysticism. Sergeant Terry McBride served 3 combat tours in Vietnam from 1966 to 1971. During this time, he participated in 137 patrol operations and performed, by his own count, no fewer than 40 sleepovers. In 2003, he publicly described the infiltration technique for the first time, and his words make the blood run cold. In an interview with Australian military historian Paul Ham, McBride revealed details that had been kept secret for decades. The first stage was called the reading. The patrol would locate an enemy camp and take up an observation position 200 to 300 meters away. There, they remained motionless for 12 to 36 hours, logging every detail. The placement of sentries, shift change times, patrol routes, latrine locations, where food was cooked, where weapons were stored. All of this was entered into a mental map. The Australians even noted what time the camp went to sleep and when sleep became deepest. The Viet Cong usually fell asleep between 2200 and 2300, and the deepest phase of sleep occurred between 300 and 400 in the morning. But this was only preparation for the most terrifying stage. The second stage, undressing. Before infiltration, SAS troopers removed everything that could clink or rustle. Dog tags, watches, compasses in metal cases. They rubbed their bodies with mud from the camp's surroundings to mask any foreign scent. Some operators put a wet rag in their mouth to prevent an accidental cough during sleep. Weapons were secured to the body in such a way that they could be instantly brought to bear with one movement, yet created not a single sound while moving. Every piece of gear was checked dozens of times. And then began what the Americans called, quote, 9. The third stage, the infiltration itself, took from 2 to 5 hours to cover a distance of 300 meters. The movement speed was approximately 1 meter per minute, 1 meter every 60 seconds. Every step was planned in advance. The foot was placed on the ground using the outside edge, then slowly rolled onto the full sole. If a dry leaf or twig was underfoot, the trooper froze and waited for a gust of wind or another natural sound to cover the completion of the step. 300 meters in 5 hours. This isn't movement in the usual sense. It is meditation in motion. But what happened at the end of this journey defied all boundaries. Australian operators didn't just penetrate the perimeter of the enemy camp. They settled in for the night in close proximity to the sleeping Viet Cong. Sometimes, literally, a few steps from enemy hammocks. McBride described a case where he spent 4 hours lying under a bush 2 meters from a Viet Cong commander, listening to his conversation with subordinates before sleep. The information gained that night, unit strength, movement plans, locations of weapon caches, was worth more than any prisoner interrogation. Why risk your life for information that can be obtained other ways? The answer is simple. Other ways simply didn't work. American intelligence relied on prisoner interrogations, radio intercepts, and informant testimony, but the Viet Cong knew these methods and adapted. They gave prisoners false information. They used couriers instead of radios. They executed informants along with their families. The only way to get reliable intel was to overhear it directly when the enemy felt safe. But gathering intelligence was only one goal of the sleepovers. The second goal was purely practical. It really was the safest place to sleep. Viet Cong scouts swept the jungle around their camps, but never checked the territory inside the perimeter. Why look for the enemy where, by definition, he cannot be? However, the third goal was the most sinister, and it was the one that caused arguments among the Allies. When the Australian SAS left an enemy camp, they left signs of their presence behind. Sometimes it was a cut hammock strap, discovered in the morning when a Viet Cong soldier fell to the ground trying to lie down. Sometimes a boot print in the center of the camp, deliberately left where it would definitely be found. Sometimes a card with an Australian military symbol slipped into a commander's pocket. The message was crystal clear. We can get to you whenever we want. We can eliminate you in your sleep. We didn't do it today, but we will tomorrow. The psychological effect of such operations surpassed any artillery barrage. Americans could burn a village with napalm, and a week later, the Viet Cong would return and start rebuilding fortifications. But after a visit from the Australian _11_ enemy units lost combat effectiveness for weeks. Soldiers refused to sleep. They fired at every rustle, giving away their positions and wasting ammunition. Commanders couldn't hold night meetings. Everyone knew the enemy might be listening. Paranoia corroded discipline more effectively than any weapon. American Colonel David Hackworth, one of the most decorated U.S. Army officers in Vietnam, observed this tactic in action in 1969. In his memoirs, he wrote lines that the Pentagon demanded be struck from the first edition. The Australians do what we cannot teach our people. Not because our people are worse, but because our doctrine doesn't allow us to even think in this direction. We teach soldiers to destroy the enemy with firepower. They teach their people to become part of the night. The result speaks for itself. But what result exactly? By 1970, the statistics became undeniable. The Australian SAS, numbering no more than 150 active operators in Vietnam at any given time, had a kill ratio of 1 to 500. These numbers caused shock even among seasoned Pentagon analysts. 1 dead Australian for every 500 enemies killed or captured. For comparison, American Rangers showed a ratio of 1 to 25. Green Berets, 1 to 40. Elite MACV-SOG units, considered the best in the U.S. Army, 1 to 60. The Australians outperformed the most effective American units by 8 to 10 times. These figures caused acute discomfort in the Pentagon. How to explain to congressmen why American units with budgets in the tens of billions of dollars were performing worse than the special forces of a country with a population smaller than the state of Texas? The official answer was simple, and it was a bald-faced lie. The Australians operate in a quieter sector. Their area of responsibility is less saturated with the enemy. They just got lucky with geography. All interested parties knew this was untrue. Phuoc Tuy Province, where the Australians operated, was considered one of the hottest zones in all of South Vietnam. 3 full-strength main force Viet Cong regiments and countless local guerrilla squads were based there. The force ratio in the Australian zone of responsibility was approximately 1 Australian to 15 Viet Cong, worse odds than most American units faced. The real reason for the Australian success was too uncomfortable to admit. American military doctrine in Vietnam was built on the principle of search and destroy. Locate the enemy, call in fire support, wipe him off the face of the earth with superior firepower. This tactic worked in Europe against conventional armies. It worked in Korea against Chinese waves of infantry. But it failed catastrophically against guerrillas who dissolved into the jungle before the first shell could hit the ground. The Australians applied a diametrically opposite approach. Their doctrine was called search and track. Upon detecting the enemy, an Australian patrol did not attack, but began a covert pursuit. American officers considered this tactic cowardly until they saw the results. For hours, days, sometimes weeks, the Australians tracked an enemy unit, marking its routes, bases, supply points. They mapped the enemy infrastructure, and only then struck, choosing the moment of maximum enemy vulnerability. Criticism intensified, especially after an incident in May 1968 when an Australian patrol detected the movement of a large Viet Cong unit and did not attack, despite having a tactical advantage. An American liaison officer demanded an explanation. The Australian commander's answer became legend in the Special Forces community. Quote 16. A week later, the Australians guided a battalion of infantry with air support to that, quote, 17, a major supply base. The enemy lost 312 men and 4 months' worth of provisions. Australian casualties were 0 men, 0, while destroying a base with 300 enemy fighters. But even this tactic was just a prelude to the main secret of Australian success. The sleepover represented the logical pinnacle of the Australian doctrine of stealth. If you can track the enemy from afar, you can get close. If you can get close, you can enter his camp. If you can enter, you can stay the night. Each subsequent step seemed impossible until it became routine for those who mastered the previous one. Australian military psychologist Dr. Mark Stebbins studied SAS veterans in the 80s and 90s. His research, partially declassified in 2010, revealed an amazing phenomenon. What he found contradicted every textbook on military psychology. Soldiers who practiced sleeping over demonstrated significantly lower levels of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, than operators who participated in traditional combat operations. Stebbins explained this as the paradox of control. When you sleep 3 meters from the enemy, you are in complete control of the situation. You chose the spot. You know the enemy's location. You can leave at any moment. Regular combat, by contrast, is chaos, explosions, screams, the inability to control what is happening. It is precisely the loss of control that traumatizes the psyche most. American psychologists refused to believe this data, but the numbers didn't lie. According to their models, proximity to a lethal threat should have multiplied stress levels, but the Australian experience demonstrated the opposite. Mastery breeds calm, and calm breeds effectiveness. SAS troopers described their state during sleepovers as a kind of meditation. They reached such a level of concentration that they merged with the environment on an almost mystical level. Of course, there was no more mysticism in this than in any other honed skill, but the roots of this mastery went back thousands of years. And here begins the most amazing part of the story. Australian Aboriginals have practiced the art of silent movement for 50,000 years, longer than any other continuous cultural tradition on the planet exists. When the Australian Army began using Aboriginal trackers to train special forces in the 50s, they gained access to techniques that Western military science couldn't even classify. Aboriginal hunters demonstrated the ability to approach prey within arm's reach while remaining undetected. They taught Australian soldiers to hear the silence, to distinguish the natural silence of the jungle from the specific silence that falls when animals freeze at the approach of a predator. One veteran described this training as a total reformatting of consciousness. Sergeant Major Rex Turnbull, who served in the SAS for 23 years, spoke of an Aboriginal instructor named Tommy Williams. According to him, for the first 3 months, he learned not technique, but a way of perceiving the world. A Western man sees the jungle as a hostile environment, stifling, dangerous, full of threats. An Aboriginal hunter sees the jungle as home, understandable, predictable, offering shelter and protection. The difference isn't in skills, but in attitude. When Australian SAS infiltrated an enemy camp, they felt at home. The Viet Cong, conversely, felt less and less confident in their own camps. The Americans tried to adopt these methods, and the result was catastrophic. In 1968, the Pentagon sent a group of instructors from the Ranger School at Fort Benning for an internship at the Australian Training Centre in Canungra. The internship lasted 6 weeks, 3 times less than the minimum course for Australian candidates. Upon return, the American instructors presented a report recommending, quote, 23 in practice. This meant adding a few hours of silent movement training to the Ranger curriculum. The deep philosophy, the hunter as part of the jungle, remained misunderstood and rejected. The very first attempt to apply this knowledge in practice ended in tragedy. In November 1969, a Ranger unit of 17 men attempted to conduct an operation on the Australian model, covert infiltration and observation of an enemy camp. 14 hours after the operation began, they were discovered. The ensuing firefight claimed the lives of 9 Americans. Survivors described that the Viet Cong seemed to know of their presence from the very beginning and were simply waiting for a convenient moment to attack. Australian officers analyzing this incident identified more than 20 critical errors. The Americans used standard army boots that left a distinctive lug sole print. They carried chewing gum, the smell of which the Vietnamese could detect from tens of meters away. They moved at a speed of about 5 meters per minute, 5 times faster than required for true stealth. They did not conduct preliminary observation of the camp. They did not clear their bowels before departure. The smell of human excrement, especially with a diet high in meat and dairy, carries in the jungle for hundreds of meters. But the most critical error was psychological, and this error could not be fixed by any training. The Americans were afraid. Fear releases adrenaline. Adrenaline changes the chemical composition of sweat. Vietnamese sentries, many of whom were hunters since childhood, literally smelled the fear. They couldn't explain it rationally. They just knew something was wrong. The Australians, in contrast, entered a state of complete calm. Their sweat didn't betray stress because there was no stress. For them, it was work, dangerous but routine. This difference between, quote, 25 and, quote, 26 defined the chasm between the American and Australian approaches. After this incident, the Pentagon made a decision that shocked many. The American command officially abandoned attempts to copy Australian methods. An internal memo signed by the Deputy Commander of Military Intelligence in Vietnam stated, quote 27, "It was a bureaucratic way of saying, we can't learn this, so we'll pretend we don't need it." But some Americans did learn, and their stories remain classified to this day. Among them was Sergeant First Class Charles Chuck Moran of MACV-SOG. Moran spent 8 months in mixed Australian-American patrols under an exchange program active in 1968 to 1969. He became one of the few Americans who not only observed sleepovers but participated in them personally. In an interview with Soldier of Fortune magazine in 1987, Moran described his first sleepover in terms the editors deemed too graphic for publication. What he told in the edited version still shocks. He lay motionless for 7 hours while a Viet Cong fighter relieved himself 4 meters away from him. That was the moment I understood what it means to be truly invisible. Not hiding, specifically being invisible. When a man looks right at you and doesn't see you because his brain refuses to register your presence. Moran called this phenomenon attention blindness, a psychological term he learned much later from researchers. The human brain does not perceive what it does not expect to see. But what happened when this blindness failed? Not all sleepovers ended successfully. Australian archives contain references to at least 17 cases where operators were discovered inside the enemy perimeter. Remarkably, none of these cases resulted in Australian casualties. The reason is simple. Protocols for action upon detection were drilled to automation. One such case became a legend among special forces worldwide. Corporal Dave Sabin, who served in the SAS from 1967 to 1972, described a situation that occurred in August 1969. His 4-man patrol was inside a Viet Cong camp of about 80 fighters. At 3 a.m., one of the Viet Cong got out of his hammock and headed toward the bush under which the Australian operator was lying. Sabin was 8 meters away and observed the situation. According to protocol, upon detection, the operator was to act on the principle of maximum shock. What happened next defies the bounds of normal military logic. The logic was this: if one enemy sees you, you have a few seconds before he raises the alarm. In these seconds, you must create a situation that paralyzes the enemy with fear and buys time for escape. The Australian operator under the bush didn't wait for the Viet Cong to spot him. When the man approached within 2 meters, the operator slowly raised his head, looked the enemy straight in the eyes, and smiled. The Viet Cong soldier's reaction entered textbooks on combat psychology. Sabin described it as pure paralyzing terror. The Viet Cong didn't scream. He didn't run. He didn't reach for his weapon. He just froze, staring at the smiling face, half covered in camouflage paint. A smile in such a situation is a violation of all expectations. The brain doesn't know how to interpret it. 3 seconds of paralysis, more than enough for a trained operator to vanish into the darkness. By the time the Viet Cong finally screamed, the Australians were already outside the perimeter. This incident spawned a legend that haunted the Viet Cong until the end of the war. The legend of Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts, Australian phantoms that appear from nowhere and vanish into nowhere. Viet Cong counterintelligence made numerous attempts to counter Australian tactics. They set tripwires with signal flares around camp perimeters. They moved camp locations every few days. They doubled the number of night sentries. They even tried deploying dogs for patrolling, but dogs were unreliable in the jungle. Too many smells, too many distractions. None of these measures yielded results, and here is why. The Australians adapted to every innovation. Signal tripwires? The SAS learned to detect and bypass them, or even more boldly, use them to create corridors through which the Viet Cong didn't expect infiltration, believing them secure. Frequent camp moves? The Australians simply lengthened the observation phase, determining the new location before infiltration began. Doubling sentries? This only increased the number of, quote, 39. More people meant more confidence in safety, and consequently, less attention. The only effective countermeasure turned out to be a move no one expected. Viet Cong commanders began deliberately spreading rumors about ghosts and demons among their soldiers. Paradoxically, this reduced the effectiveness of Australian psychological warfare. If a soldier already believes in demons, it is harder to demoralize him with an encounter with a real, quote, 40. He interprets it as confirmation of the supernatural, not as proof of his camp's vulnerability. But even this move had a downside. Superstitious soldiers became less combat effective, deserted more often, and followed orders poorly. By 1971, the war was ending for the Australians, but their legacy was just beginning its journey. The last SAS units left Vietnam in December of that year, leaving behind a reputation that would spark debate among military historians for decades. The final statistics looked like this. Over the entire period of participation in the war, the Australian SAS lost 22 men killed in action. The documented number of enemies destroyed, more than 500. The number of intelligence gathering operations, over 1,800. The ratio of successful operations to failed ones, 94-6. By all metrics, this was the most effective use of special forces in the history of warfare, but recognition came only decades later. The American command officially recognized this effectiveness only in 1985, when General William Westmoreland, former commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, gave an interview for an Australian TV documentary. His words became a sensation. "If I had 10,000 Australian SAS instead of 500,000 American infantrymen, the outcome of the war might have been different." Westmoreland quickly tried to walk back these words, but it was too late. He called his statement an exaggeration for the purpose of complimenting allies, but the recording circulated through military academies worldwide. The truth, as always, was more complex than any simplification. Australian success in Vietnam cannot be explained solely by tactical superiority. The scale of operations and political constraints played major roles. Australia sent about 60,000 troops to Vietnam over the entire war, fewer than the U.S. lost killed in action. Australian units could afford the luxury of careful personnel selection and lengthy training, but one lesson of the Australian experience remained undeniable, and it changed special operations forever. The sleepover tactic survived Vietnam and entered the arsenal of 21st century special operations. Details remain classified, but it is known that elements of Australian methodology were integrated into the training programs of the British SAS, New Zealand NZSAS, and, according to some reports, the American Delta Force in the 80s. Former Delta commander Charles Beckwith publicly acknowledged the influence of Australian experience on the formation of his unit. In Afghanistan and Iraq, these methods found new life. Coalition forces regularly used covert infiltration for reconnaissance tactics, a direct heir to the Australian sleepovers. Operators entered settlements controlled by the Taliban or insurgents and spent hours or days there, gathering information for subsequent strikes. Technology changed. Night vision devices, thermal imagers, and drones appeared. But the basic principle remained the same. The safest place is where they aren't looking for you. The Australian SAS continued to develop this tradition, with results that remain classified. In 2010, Australian operators conducted a series of operations in the Afghan province of Uruzgan, which official sources described as _46_. What exactly that euphemism meant, one can only guess. But Vietnam veterans reading these reports recognized the handwriting. War changes, technology evolves, but some principles remain eternal. However, the history of _47 has another dimension, one rarely spoken of publicly. We are talking about the psychological price operators paid for their mastery of invisibility. Not PTSD in its classic sense. As mentioned, _48_ veterans demonstrated surprisingly low levels of PTSD, but another phenomenon, which military psychologists called _49_ Dr. Mark Stebbins, who studied SAS veterans for 20 years, described this syndrome as follows. What he found questioned the very nature of the human psyche. Operators who systematically practiced covert infiltration had difficulty returning to normal social life after demobilization, not because of trauma or fear, but because of an altered perception of human relationships. They were used to seeing people as objects of observation, not subjects of interaction. They automatically assessed _50 in any room, escape routes from any situation, vulnerabilities of any interlocutor. One veteran described this state in words that give you goosebumps. _51. Another recalled catching himself. _52. His own family, noting their habits, daily schedules, moments of inattention. Stebbins gave this phenomenon a name that became a term in military psychology. When skills necessary for survival in extreme conditions become a permanent part of the personality and interfere with normal functioning in peacetime. The Australian Department of Veterans Affairs refused to officially recognize this syndrome for a long time. Firstly, it didn't fit into existing diagnostic categories. Secondly, and this is the main point, recognizing it meant admitting exactly what SAS operators were doing in Vietnam, and _55 remained one of the most carefully guarded secrets of the Australian Armed Forces. Declassification began gradually, with the release of memoirs by individual veterans and studies by military historians. A key moment was the publication of Paul Ham's book, Vietnam, The Australian War in 2007. Ham gained access to previously closed archives and described the covert infiltration tactic in full for the first time. The book caused a storm in Australian society. Many simply could not believe their countrymen were capable of such things. The reaction of the veteran community was mixed and split former comrades in arms. Some former operators welcomed the publication. Finally, their real contribution to the war received recognition. Others were outraged by the violation of the unspoken code of silence that had operated in the SAS community for decades. "Some things should stay in the jungle," said one critic of declassification. "Not because we are hiding something, but because civilians won't understand. They will look at us like monsters. And we were just doing our job." These fears turned out to be largely justified, and consequences were not long in coming. When information about sleepovers and the accompanying psychological warfare, leaving signs, smiles upon detection, systematic intimidation of the enemy, became public knowledge, the reaction was predictably polarized. For some, these were stories of outstanding professionalism and ingenuity. For others, evidence of something darker, bordering on a violation of the unwritten rules of war. Critics pointed out, psychological intimidation is one thing, but the systematic transformation of war into a manhunt with corresponding rituals and practices is something else entirely. The main question critics asked had no simple answer. What happens to a man who trains for years to think of the enemy as prey? What happens to a society that creates and glorifies such men? Defenders of Australian methods answered pragmatically. War is not a nightly tournament. The soldier's task is to win with minimal casualties for his side. If psychological pressure achieves this more effectively than mass bombings, is that not a more humane approach? Statistics seemed to be on their side, but critics had their own argument. Civilian casualty statistics in Australian zones of responsibility were significantly lower than in American sectors. Perhaps the quote 61, for all its moral ambiguity, is more humane than quote 62. This discussion has no simple resolution, just as war itself has no simple resolution. In 2020, the Australian SAS found itself at the center of public attention again, but for a completely different reason. What came to light during the investigation shook the entire country. The Brereton report by the Inspector General regarding the actions of Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan revealed numerous cases of alleged violations of the laws of war. 39 Afghan civilians, according to the investigation's conclusion, were unlawfully killed by Australian operators between 2005 and 2016. These accusations had no direct relation to the sleepover tactic or Vietnam-era methods, but they forced many to ask an uncomfortable question. Is there a link between the hunter culture cultivated in the SAS for decades and the crimes committed in Afghanistan? Some critics argued, when you teach men to treat the enemy as prey, you create the preconditions for dehumanization, and dehumanization is the first step toward crimes against humanity. Defenders of the regiment furiously rejected this link. In their view, the Afghan incidents were the result of failures in command and control, not a consequence of tactical culture. Their argument sounded convincing, but not to everyone. A professional hunter knows boundaries. He doesn't touch non-targets, doesn't cause unnecessary suffering, observes the laws of the hunt. Crimes are committed not by hunters, but by poachers. This discussion is far from over and, perhaps, will never be concluded. Returning to the sleepovers, it is worth noting, this tactic was born of the specific circumstances of the Vietnam War and the specific capabilities of the Australian Armed Forces, but it demonstrated a principle that remains relevant for any era. Information superiority can compensate for a lack of force. The Americans in Vietnam had absolute superiority in firepower, logistics, and technology, but they lost the information war at the tactical level. They didn't know where the enemy was, what he was planning, how he thought. The Australians, for all their small numbers, knew this better, and this knowledge turned their tiny patrols into a threat disproportionate to their size. Modern armed forces have spent billions solving this problem, but haven't found a replacement for the human. Satellites, drones, communication intercepts, data analysis, all these tools are useful, but they cannot fully replace a human lying 3 meters from an enemy commander listening to his plans. Technology shows where the enemy is. The man on the ground understands what the enemy is going to do. This lesson from Vietnam remains relevant even 50 years after the war ended. Special Operations historian Peter MacDonald formulated it best. The Americans brought the philosophy of industrial war to Vietnam. Victory through mass production of firepower. The Australians brought the philosophy of artisanal war. Victory through individual craftsmanship. In that specific war, craft proved more effective than production. That doesn't mean it will always be so. It means universal solutions do not exist. The sleepover was the quintessence of this artisanal approach. It could not be scaled, automated, or standardized. It required something that cannot be bought for any amount of money. Exceptional men who had undergone exceptional training and possessed exceptional psychological resilience. There were few such men, and that is exactly why the tactic worked. The enemy couldn't adapt to it because the very nature of the tactic implied constant adaptation by the executors. When Australians entered an enemy camp, they didn't follow a manual. They improvised every second using everything they had been taught. Aboriginal tracker skills, knowledge of human psychology, understanding of the landscape. This hunter's instinct, everything merged into one. No manual could foresee every possible situation. Only a prepared human could make the right decision in real time. This brings us back to the main question. Can one learn to be a ghost? The answer given by SAS operators themselves sounded paradoxical. You can't learn it, but you can become it. The difference is that learning implies the transfer of knowledge from teacher to student. But becoming is a transformation the student undergoes himself, using the teacher only as a guide. Aboriginal instructors explained this in language that is 50,000 years old. The hunter does not learn to hunt. He learns to be part of the hunt. The jungle, the prey, the hunter himself, all are elements of a single process in which there is no division into subject and object. When a Western man enters the jungle, he opposes it. When an Aboriginal hunter enters the jungle, he joins it. This philosophy, translated into the language of military science, meant the SAS operator does not penetrate the enemy camp as an outsider. He becomes part of that camp, a shadow that was always there. Sounds mystical, but behind this mysticism stands a concrete psychotechnique. Total acceptance of the situation, refusal of resistance, dissolution of the ego in the task. When there is no I afraid of being discovered, fear disappears. When there is no fear, adrenaline disappears. When there is no adrenaline, the scent of prey disappears. Western psychologists call this state flow, complete immersion in an activity where self-consciousness temporarily shuts off. Athletes, musicians, surgeons experience this state in moments of peak performance. Australian operators learn to enter it on command and stay in it for hours. Techniques for entering this state were passed from generation to generation of operators but were never formalized in official manuals, partly because they are hard to describe in words, partly because command feared. If these methods became widely known, they would lose their effectiveness. One veteran described the preparation for a sleepover as follows. What he said looks more like the meditation of a Buddhist monk than military training. Several hours before the operation began, he started a special breathing rhythm, slow even, almost imperceptible. This rhythm gradually slowed his heartbeat and brought the organism into a state of deep rest. In parallel, he visualized himself as part of the landscape, not a man hiding among trees, but the tree itself, the bush itself, the earth itself. By the moment movement began, he no longer felt like a separate being, only a function of observation moving through space. Another operator used a different method, no less striking. He concentrated on the sounds of the jungle, gradually dissolving his internal dialogue into them. When the inner voice fell silent, the body fell silent too. All involuntary movements we make unconsciously ceased. He became absolutely motionless, not through tense self-control, but through total relaxation. A third method involved meditating on the object of observation. The enemy camp was perceived not as a threat, but as a riddle to be solved. Curiosity displaced fear. Research interest replaced the instinct of self-preservation. All these techniques had a common foundation, and it was this that made the Australians invincible. Shifting focus from oneself to the surrounding world, the question arises, why didn't these methods gain widespread adoption in other armies of the world? Why didn't the Americans, British, Israelis, all nations with advanced special operations forces adopt the Australian experience in full? The answer has several dimensions. The first barrier proved cultural and impossible to overcome. Western military culture is based on active action, not passive observation. A good soldier in the American understanding is one who attacks, dominates, wins. A good soldier in the Australian understanding is one who completes the task, whatever it may be. If the task requires 20 hours of immobility, then 20 hours of immobility. The second barrier was institutional. Military organizations are conservative by nature. They reproduce what worked in the past and view radical innovations with suspicion. The third barrier proved the most insurmountable of all. Training an operator capable of sleepovers took 1.5 to 2 years of intensive training. Most armies of the world could not afford such luxury. They needed soldiers here and now, not in 2 years. Finally, the psychological barrier. Not all people are capable of undergoing such a transformation. According to Australian instructors, only 2 or 3 out of 10 volunteers possess the necessary psychological qualities to work in ghost mode. The rest could become excellent soldiers, but not hunters. What did this unique combination of skills, culture, and psychology lead to? To the creation of a unit that occupies a special place in the history of special operations. The Australian SAS of the Vietnam era wasn't the largest, best equipped, or most famous special forces unit in that war, but it was, perhaps, the most effective relative to its resources. This achievement did not receive deserved recognition in its time, partly due to secrecy, partly due to political inconvenience. Australia wanted to forget Vietnam just as much as America did. Only decades later did historians begin to reconstruct the picture of what happened in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy province. Today, the Quote 76 is known mostly to a narrow circle of special operations historians. It isn't in textbooks, it isn't mentioned in popular movies about Vietnam, it isn't discussed in political debates about the war. But for those who know this story, it remains a testament to what a human is capable of when superiority in force is impossible and only superiority in spirit remains. Sergeant Terry McBride passed away in 2017, but his final words are worth remembering forever. People ask if I was scared sleeping next to the enemy. I answer, scared is when you don't know where the enemy is. When you are inside his camp, there is no fear. There is only work. This philosophy, turning fear into mastery, chaos into control, defined the Australian approach to special operations in Vietnam. It wasn't the result of superior resources or better weaponry. It grew out of necessity. A small country with limited capabilities had to find a way to fight smarter, not bigger, and it found that way in traditions that were 50,000 years old. When American officers asked Australians how to learn their methods, the answer was usually discouragingly simple. Stop thinking like an army. Start thinking like a hunter. Few Americans understood what that meant. Those who understood never forgot. The sleepover tactic remains one of the most striking pages in the history of special operations. It challenges all intuitive notions of war and safety. It demonstrates that mastery can surpass superior forces, and psychology can surpass firepower. And it reminds us, the most dangerous warriors are not those who shoot the loudest. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts. The Americans called them those crazy Aussies. They called themselves simply SAS, the Special Air Service, men who slept in the arms of the enemy and woke up winners. Not because they were immortal or fearless, but because they found a way to turn fear into a tool, the jungle into an ally, and war into a hunt. This was their way, and it worked.